I am your host, Miss Marple. Let's begin our journey.
The annual summer fete at St. Mary's Vicarage was traditionally an afternoon of polite competition and excessive amounts of sponge cake. The sun, a rare and welcome visitor to the village of St. Mary Mead, bathed the vicarage gardens in a warm golden hue that seemed to promise nothing but tranquility. Reverend Clement moved among his parishioners with a look of mild bewilderment, his mind likely wandering toward his upcoming sermon on the virtues of patience, while his wife, Griselda, attempted to prevent the local children from prematurely dismantling the coconut shy. It was the quintessential English afternoon, complete with the scent of crushed grass and the distant, rhythmic thud of a cricket bat from the nearby green. Miss Marple sat in a folding canvas chair near the embroidery stall, her knitting needles clicking with a soft, hypnotic cadence. From her vantage point, she could observe the subtle social currents that flowed beneath the surface of the festivities. She noticed how Lady Tressilian avoided the gaze of the retired Colonel Prothero, and how the young village schoolmaster, Mr. Sanford, seemed particularly anxious to stay within sight of the vicarage's side entrance. Miss Marple's eyes, mild and seemingly preoccupied with a complicated cable stitch, missed very little of the human comedy playing out before her. To the casual observer, she was merely a frail, elderly woman enjoying the air. In reality, she was a seasoned observer of the small, repetitive patterns of human behavior that so often heralded a storm. The afternoon's peace was shattered not by a sudden storm, but by a sound far more discordant. It was the frantic ringing of the handbell from the tea tent, followed immediately by a sharp, strangled cry from the direction of the vicar's study. The merry-go-round music ground to a halt as if the air itself had been sucked out of the garden. A heavy, expectant silence fell over the crowd, broken only by the sound of running footsteps on the gravel path. Griselda Clement emerged from the house, her face ashen, clutching the doorframe for support. She tried to speak, but the words seemed to catch in her throat until she finally managed to gasp out a single terrifying sentence. Inside the study, slumped over the Reverend's heavy mahogany desk, was Colonel Prothero. The man who had spent his life demanding order and discipline now lay in a state of ultimate disarray. A single dark entry wound in his temple told the story of a life ended with violent precision. The room, usually smelling of old parchment and tobacco, was now thick with the metallic tang of blood and the acrid scent of gunpowder. The window stood open to the garden, the lace curtains fluttering gently in the breeze as if mocking the stillness of the man in the chair. The shock rippled through the garden like a physical blow. Lady Tressilian fainted into a patch of petunias, and the Colonel's young wife, Anne, stood frozen by the lemonade stand, her face a mask of unreadable emotion. Miss Marple did not join the rush toward the house. Instead, she remained in her chair for a moment, her needles finally still. She looked toward the study window and then down at her knitting, her mind already sifting through the afternoon's small anomalies. The way the Colonel had checked his watch 3 times in 10 minutes, and the curious absence of the vicar's curate just before the shot. The fete was over, and a far more grim business had begun. In St. Mary Mead, the shadows were always longest when the sun shone brightest. The morning following the tragedy at the vicarage, St. Mary Mead felt like a teapot on the verge of whistling. The shock of Colonel Prothero's demise had transitioned rapidly into a feverish competitive display of speculation. At the village post office, which served as the central nervous system for local intelligence, the air was thick with the scent of damp wool and excitement. Mrs. Price Ridley, a woman whose capacity for indignation was matched only by her hearing, was already holding court near the counter. She proclaimed to anyone within earshot that the crime was undoubtedly the work of a wandering tramp, or perhaps a disgruntled former soldier from the neighbouring county. It was far more comfortable for the village to imagine a predatory outsider than to accept that one of their own had pulled the trigger. In the small, sun-drenched parlour of her cottage, Miss Marple sat with her old friend, Mrs. Hartnell. The latter was brimming with the kind of grim satisfaction that certain people derive from being adjacent to a scandal. "It's simply appalling, Jane," Mrs. Hartnell said, leaning forward until her hat nearly touched Miss Marple's knitting. The Colonel was a difficult man, of course, pompous, rigid, and quite unbearable about the parish accounts, but to be shot in cold blood. And in the vicar's own study, people are saying that the clock in the room was found smashed, frozen at a time that doesn't match the shot at all. It's like something out of a sensationalist novel. Miss Marple listened with the patient, slightly distracted air of a cat watching a bird through a window. She knew that gossip was like a kaleidoscope. Every time you shook it, the pieces rearranged themselves into a different, yet equally colourful pattern. "People do love a smashed clock, don't they, dear?" she replied mildly. "It provides such a solid mathematical feel to a mystery. But clocks can be moved, and times can be faked. It reminds me so much of the time the church warden's daughter claimed she was home by 10 because the grandfather clock struck the hour, forgetting that her younger brother had set it back 20 minutes to hide his own late arrival." One must always ask why a clock would choose to be so helpful to the police. Across the village at the Blue Boar, the theories were more robust and considerably more cynical. The local men discussed the Colonel's notoriously prickly nature. He'd been a man who made an art form of being disliked, holding positions on the bench and the vestry with a zeal that bordered on the tyrannical. Everyone, it seemed, had a reason to wish him gone. There was the matter of the poached pheasants, the disputed rights of way, and the constant threats of legal action against the vicar for perceived mismanagement of funds. To the men at the bar, the Colonel had finally pushed someone too far, and that someone had likely been the young, hot-headed artist staying at the inn, Mr. Lawrence Redding, who had been seen painting in the vicarage garden far too often for it to be purely professional. The reaction of the household at the vicarage was one of stunned, hollowed-out silence. Griselda Clement moved through the rooms like a ghost, her usual vibrant energy extinguished by the presence of the police and the heavy, lingering smell of fingerprint powder. The vicar himself had retreated into a state of scholarly detachment, though his hands trembled whenever he had to handle the mail. They were acutely aware that the village was watching them, judging the timing of their movements and the sincerity of their grief. In a small town, a murder is not just a crime, it is a social performance, and the audience is relentlessly critical of the actors. Miss Marple, observing the flow of people past her garden gate, noted the subtle changes in the village's equilibrium. She saw the way Anne Prothero, now a widow, drove her car with a rigid, frozen posture, her eyes fixed straight ahead. She noted how the curate, Mr. Hawes, seemed to have developed a sudden, persistent headache that kept him confined to his lodgings. These were the small, jagged edges of the truth beginning to poke through the fabric of village life. To the rest of the world, these were just the reactions of stressed individuals. But Miss Marple knew better. She knew that beneath the shared horror and the endless chatter at the post office, there were specific private reliefs and specific private terrors. The village had reacted with a roar of gossip, but the real secrets were being kept in the silences between the words. The arrival of Inspector Slack was much like the arrival of a sudden localized thunderstorm. He was a man of immense energy and very little patience, possessing a personality that seemed to consist entirely of sharp corners and aggressive efficiency. He moved through the vicar's study with a brisk military step, his notebook snapping open and shut like a trap. To Inspector Slack, the murder of Colonel Prothero was a problem of angles, distances, and ballistics. He measured the height of the desk, the position of the body, and the trajectory of the bullet with a grim determination to reduce the tragedy to a series of undeniable measurements. He was the sort of man who believed that if one collected enough facts, the truth would eventually be forced to surrender out of sheer exhaustion. Miss Marple, meanwhile, remained in her garden, her attention seemingly focused on a particularly stubborn patch of groundsel near the fence. However, her position allowed her a clear view of the vicar's gate and the lane beyond. She watched as the inspector's men combed the shrubbery, their heavy boots trampling the very flower beds that Griselda Clement worked so hard to maintain. They were looking for a discarded weapon or a muddy footprint. But Miss Marple was looking at the way people walked. She noticed that the local physician, Dr. Haydock, arrived with his medical bag, but appeared more concerned with the state of the vicar's nerves than with the technicalities of the corpse. She also observed the arrival of the colonel's daughter, Lettice, whose flamboyant grief seemed to Miss Marple to be a trifle too choreographed, as if she were playing the part of the grieving waif for an audience of one. The early investigation focused heavily on the timeline of the shots. Several witnesses, including Mrs. Price Ridley, claimed to have heard a loud bang at exactly 20 minutes past 6. This coincided neatly with a note found on the desk, ostensibly written by the colonel himself, which was timed at 6:20. To Inspector Slack, this was the golden nugget of the case, a precise moment of death. He spent the morning questioning the household about their whereabouts at that exact minute. The vicar had been at the church, Griselda had been in the village, and the curate had been resting in his rooms. It was all very neat, yet Miss Marple found herself troubled by the very tidiness of it. "It is all so very convenient, isn't it?" she remarked to the vicar later that afternoon, as they sat in the garden while the police continued their work inside. The note, the clock, the loud noise heard by the most talkative woman in the parish. It reminds me of the time the old schoolmaster's cat was stolen by a neighbour. Everything pointed to the man next door, the open gate, the bowl of cream on his porch. But it turned out the cat had simply followed a trail of fish scales left by a boy who wanted to cause a feud. People often provide the evidence they think we expect to see. The vicar sighed, looking older and more tired than Miss Marple had ever seen him. "Slack is convinced it was a crime of passion, Jane. He's already looking at young Lawrence Redding. They found a pistol in his studio that matches the caliber, and everyone knows he and the colonel had words over that portrait of Anne." "Mr. Redding is a very impulsive young man," Miss Marple agreed, her needles resuming their steady click. "But impulse usually leads to a messy crime, not one with timed notes and strategically placed noises. A man who shoots in a rage doesn't usually remember to check his watch and write the time on a memorandum. And then there is the study window issue. It was open, yet the dust on the sill was quite undisturbed. If a man had climbed in or out in a hurry, he would have left more than just a memory. She was also pondering the behaviour of the curate, Mr. Hawes. He had been acting in a most peculiar fashion, alternating between fits of religious fervour and deep, dark silences. He had been the one to find the body, and his reaction had been described by the maid as excessive. To Miss Marple, who had seen many a guilty conscience manifest as a sudden devotion to duty, Mr. Hawes was a figure of significant interest. She noted that while the inspector was busy measuring the room, he had failed to notice that the colonel's heavy signet ring was missing from his hand, a detail that spoke of something other than a simple dispute over a portrait. While the police looked for the who through the where, Miss Marple was beginning to find the who through the why. She sat in the fading light, her mind weaving a much more complex tapestry than the one Inspector Slack was so busily constructing. The following morning the atmosphere in St. Mary Mead had shifted from generalized curiosity to a sharp, clinical focus. Inspector Slack, a man who loathed ambiguity as much as he loathed a slow-moving queue, strode across the village green with the air of a conqueror. By noon, the inevitable had occurred. Lawrence Redding had been taken into custody. The evidence against the young artist was, in the inspector's estimation, an insurmountable mountain of guilt. Not only had the murder weapon, a Mauser pistol, been discovered in his studio, but Lawrence had provided a confession that was almost too eager in its self-reproach. He claimed to have entered the study in a fit of temper, and fired the fatal shot before fleeing through the garden. To the police, it was the perfect conclusion to a sordid tale of an older man's jealousy and a younger man's uncontrollable fire. The village, for the most part, accepted this development with a sense of grim relief. Mrs. Price Ridley was heard in the baker's shop declaring that she had always seen the mark of Cain upon Mr. Redding's brow, citing his preference for bright neckties and modern art as clear indicators of a murderous temperament. The case seemed to have reached its final act before the first week was out. Even the vicar, though saddened by the waste of a young life, found himself unable to argue with the sheer weight of the physical facts. The Mauser belonged to Lawrence, the motive was public knowledge, and the confession was signed and witnessed. It was a closed book, a tidy sum, a tragedy resolved with the efficiency of a well-run military operation. Miss Marple, however, remained profoundly unconvinced. She sat in her parlour with a glass of her own damson wine, her expression one of mild, troubled contemplation. She had watched Lawrence Redding being led away, and she had seen something in his face that the inspector had missed. It was not the look of a man who had committed a murder, but rather the look of a man who was playing a part in a very different sort of drama. It reminded her of young Arthur Halliday, who had once confessed to stealing a neighbour's prize-winning roses to protect the girl he loved, only for it to be discovered that the girl herself had forgotten she'd already sold them to a travelling merchant. "It is a very noble thing, I suppose," Miss Marple remarked to Griselda Clement, who had come by for a brief respite from the tension at the vicarage, "to offer oneself up as a sacrifice. But nobility and truth are rarely the same thing. Mr. Redding is a romantic, and romantics are prone to making very foolish gestures when they believe someone they care for is in danger. A man who truly commits a murder in a rage does not usually walk into a police station and hand over the evidence with such a flourish. He tries to hide it, he lies, he makes excuses." Griselda looked at her with wide, tired eyes. "But Jane, he said he did it. He described the play and shot." "Why would anyone lie about something so terrible?" "Because he believes Anne Prothero did it," Miss Marple replied, her knitting needles picking up speed, "and he is determined to save her, regardless of the cost to himself. But there is a glaring inconsistency that the inspector has overlooked in his haste. Lawrence claims he shot the colonel at 6:20, immediately following their argument. Yet several witnesses saw Anne near the village pond at that exact moment, quite far from the vicarage. If he is lying for her, and she could not have done it, then the entire structure of his confession falls to pieces. It is like a house built on sand, my dear. It looks solid until the tide comes in. Furthermore, Miss Marple found herself dwelling on the nature of the wound. Dr. Haydock had mentioned, almost in passing, that the trajectory suggested the killer was standing in a very specific, almost awkward position behind the desk. It was a position that Lawrence, in his supposed fit of temper, would have been unlikely to take. It spoke of deliberation, of waiting in the shadows for the perfect moment. She also considered the missing signet ring. If Lawrence had shot the colonel in a moment of passion, why would he stop to strip a ring from a dead man's finger? It was a cold, calculated act of theft that did not fit the profile of a crime of passion. As the sun began to set, casting long, skeletal shadows across the parlour floor, Miss Marple realized that the arrest of Lawrence Redding had served only one purpose. It had provided the real killer with a perfect shield. While the village celebrated the solution, the true perpetrator was likely sitting at home, perhaps even joining in the expressions of shock and pity. The secret at the vicarage was not to be found in a confession or a discarded pistol, but in the small, seemingly insignificant details that Slack had dismissed as clutter. Miss Marple adjusted her shawl, her mind already moving toward the one person who had been overlooked in the rush to judgment, and the one clue that would eventually bring the entire facade of Lawrence's confession crashing down. The following morning, Miss Marple found herself standing in the vicar's study, having secured entry under the pretense of returning a borrowed volume on ecclesiastical history. The police had officially cleared the room, yet it still held a faint, lingering heaviness that seemed to cling to the velvet curtains. Inspector Slack had moved on to the technicalities of the trial, satisfied that his measurements had captured the essence of the crime. He had seen the desk, the chair, and the bloodstain, but he had not truly seen the room. Miss Marple, however, stood perfectly still, her eyes travelling slowly over the surfaces with the patient curiosity of a bird-watcher. She was not looking for a weapon, she was looking for a lack of harmony in the domestic arrangement. It was then that she noticed it, a tiny, almost invisible discrepancy on the mahogany side table that stood near the open window. A small decorative ceramic bowl, usually filled with potpourri, had been moved several inches to the left. In its original place was a faint circular ring of dust. To a man like Slack, this was merely a housekeeping oversight, but to Miss Marple, who knew that the vicar's maid, Mary, was a girl of obsessive tidiness, it was a profound inconsistency. She leaned in closer, her spectacles sliding slightly down her nose. Beside the bowl, caught in a small splinter of the wood, was a single tiny strand of bright iridescent blue silk. It was not the colour of any garment worn by the household, nor did it match the sober tweeds of the late Colonel Prothero. She retrieved the thread with a pair of small tweezers from her knitting bag and held it up to the morning light. It was a peculiar shade, the sort one might find on a very expensive evening wrap or perhaps a theatrical costume. It reminded her of a case in St. Mary Mead involving a missing post office order and a woman who had tried to hide a new silk scarf in a chimney. People often forget that their clothes tell stories even when their mouths remain shut. This blue thread suggested a presence that was elegant, deliberate, and entirely out of place in a clergyman's study on a hot summer afternoon. Miss Marple then turned her attention to the open window. The police had focused on the possibility of an intruder climbing in, but Miss Marple was more interested in what could be seen from the outside looking in. She stepped through the French doors and walked toward the dense shrubbery that bordered the study. There, hidden among the leaves of a large laurel bush, she found a small, flattened area of grass. It was not the footprint of a man in a hurry, but rather the sustained impression of someone who had been standing still for a long time. Beside the impression lay a discarded cigarette end, but it was not the brand favoured by Lawrence Redding or the Colonel. It was a long, slim, gold-tipped cigarette, the kind that spoke of luxury and perhaps a touch of foreign affectation. "It is quite remarkable," she whispered to herself, "how much effort people put into being noticed in all the wrong ways." She thought of the loud bang heard by Mrs. Price Ridley at 6:20. If the shot had truly been fired then, why was this silk thread snagged on a table several feet away from the desk? And why would an observer in the bushes be smoking such a distinctive cigarette if they intended to remain anonymous? It occurred to Miss Marple that the bang might not have been a shot at all, but a signal, a bit of stagecraft designed to fix a specific time in the minds of the villagers. The hidden clue was not the silk or the cigarette individually, but the fact that they pointed toward a third party who had been neither a victim nor a confessed killer. This person had been a witness, perhaps an unwilling one, who had left a trail of their own panic behind. Miss Marple tucked the thread into a small envelope, her mind turning toward the various visitors who had stayed at the local inn, or visited the great house recently. She recalled seeing a woman in a blue silk rap at the fete, someone who had stood on the periphery of the crowd, watching the study window with an intensity that had seemed like mere curiosity at the time. She realized then that the mystery of the vicar's study was a play within a play. There was the obvious drama of Lawrence and Anne, which was a tragedy of errors, and then there was the silent drama of the person in the bushes, which was a comedy of secrets. The inspector was happy with his confession, and the village was happy with its scandal, but Miss Marple felt the cold shiver of a different truth. Someone had stood in those bushes, watched a murder happen, and had then quietly walked away to finish their gold-tipped cigarette. The question was whether they were silent because they were afraid or because they were waiting for a better opportunity to profit from what they had seen. The following afternoon, the sun-drenched streets of St. Mary Mead seemed to hold their breath as the initial satisfaction of Lawrence Redding's arrest began to sour into a pervasive, restless curiosity. Miss Marple, recognizing that the physical evidence of silk and cigarettes was merely the skeleton of the truth, set out to clothe it in the flesh of human history. She understood that in a village no act is ever truly isolated. Every event is the culmination of years of quiet resentment, hidden debts and ancient grievances. Her first stop was the cottage of Mrs. Weatherby, a woman who possessed a memory like a meticulously indexed filing cabinet for every social slight and moral failing that had occurred in the county since the turn of the century. "The Colonel was a man of many virtues, I suppose," Mrs. Weatherby remarked, her voice dripping with a type of charity that felt remarkably like malice. She was seated in her garden, her eyes fixed on the distant chimneys of Old Hall, the Protheroe estate. But he was also a man who never forgot a face or a financial irregularity. Did you know, Jane, that before he married the young Anne, he was involved in a most unpleasant business in the West Indies, something to do with a plantation, and a very young woman who was left quite destitute when the Colonel decided his career required a more respectable British alliance. There was a child, too, or so the rumours went. He had a way of tidying up his life that left a great deal of dust under the carpets. This revelation of a hidden past in the tropics added a new, darker hue to the tapestry Miss Marple was weaving. She thought of the iridescent blue silk and the gold-tipped cigarette, symbols of a worldly sophistication that did not belong to the dusty parlours of St. Mary Mead. It suggested that the Colonel's past was not as buried as he had hoped. Miss Marple then turned her attention to the local curate, Mr. Hawes. She found him in the vestry, his hands shaking as he sorted through the hymnals. He was a man who seemed to be hollowed out by a secret fear, his eyes darting toward the door at every footfall on the stone floor. "It is a heavy burden, the care of souls," Miss Marple said gently, appearing to be focused on a loose thread on her glove, especially when those souls are as troubled as poor Colonel Protheroe's. "He was very hard on you, I hear, regarding the missing church funds. It must have been a great relief when the accounts were finally settled, though I understand the Colonel was still threatening to call for a full audit by the diocese just before his accident." Hawes turned ashen, his knuckles whitening as he gripped the edge of the table. "He was a vindictive man, Miss Marple. He saw sin where there was only human weakness. He was going to ruin me for a clerical error that was rectified months ago. He enjoyed the power of the secret more than the justice of the cause. This was another motive, one rooted in the raw, primal instinct for professional survival. To a man of the cloth, a public scandal regarding money would be a death sentence of a different kind." As she walked back toward her own cottage, Miss Marple encountered Lettice Protheroe, the Colonel's daughter from his first marriage. The girl was wandering near the village pond, her yellow sundress a bright contrast to her sullen, shadowed expression. There was no love lost between the girl and her stepmother, Anne, and even less between her and her late father. "He wanted to send me away, you know," Lettice said abruptly, skipping a stone across the water without looking at Miss Marple, "to some aunt in Scotland. He said I was fast and a bad influence on the village. He was going to change his will on Monday. He told me so on the morning of the fete. He said he was tired of my theatrical nonsense." Miss Marple watched the ripples on the pond, her mind connecting the threads. The abandoned mother from the West Indies, the terrified curate, the resentful daughter, and the romantic artist all formed a circle of motive around the fallen Colonel. Each had a secret that Protheroe had been holding like a weapon. The mystery was no longer a question of who had a gun, but who had the most to lose if the Colonel had stayed alive until Monday. The village was a powder keg of buried lives, and the Colonel had been the one walking around with a lit match. As she reached her gate, Miss Marple realized that the iridescent silk and the gold-tipped cigarette belonged to someone who hadn't just come to kill, but perhaps to reclaim something that had been stolen long ago. The following morning, the fragile peace of St. Mary Mead was shattered not by another act of violence, but by a revelation that seemed to turn the entire investigation inside out. A stranger had arrived at the Blue Boar late the previous evening, a woman of striking elegance whose presence was as conspicuous in the village as a tropical bird in a pigeon loft. By breakfast, the news had spread with the speed of a summer wildfire. This woman, a Mrs. Lestrange, had not only been seen near the vicarage on the night of the murder, but she had now come forward to claim that she was the one who had been in the study just minutes before the shot was fired. Miss Marple, hearing this from her maid, Jane, felt the final piece of a very complicated jigsaw puzzle begin to vibrate with significance. She recalled the iridescent blue silk thread and the gold-tipped cigarette. Mrs. Lestrange, it appeared, was the physical manifestation of the clues she had found in the shadows of the laurel bushes. The inspector, already weary from Lawrence Redding's erratic confession, was now faced with a woman who admitted to a confrontation with the Colonel but denied the killing. Mrs. Lestrange claimed she had come to Old Hall to settle a debt of honour from the past, the very past Mrs. Weatherby had hinted at, but found the Colonel in such a state of agitation that she had fled the house before any violence occurred. However, the twist came when Dr. Haydock, after a long and secretive meeting with the stranger, emerged with a look of profound gravity. He informed Inspector Slack that Mrs. Lestrange was not a murderer but a dying woman. She had come to St. Mary Mead not for revenge but for a final, desperate reconciliation with someone she had lost years ago. This revelation shifted the village's suspicion away from the outsider and back onto the familiar faces of the parish. If Mrs. Lestrange had been in the study and left while the Colonel was still alive, then the timeline established by the bang at 6:20 became even more suspicious. Miss Marple sat in her garden, her knitting needles moving with a ferocious, silent speed. She was thinking of the nature of time. If the shot heard by Mrs. Price Ridley was a signal, then the Colonel must have been dead before it was fired. This meant that every person who had an alibi for 6:20 was suddenly a potential suspect again. She recalled the vicar's mention of the smashed clock, its hands frozen at the very moment the village believed the crime had happened. It was a classic piece of misdirection, a theatrical trick designed to make the audience look at the left hand, while the right hand performed the deed. The focus of the mystery began to narrow onto the one person who had remained most silent throughout the ordeal, the curate, Mr. Hawes. Miss Marple remembered his excessive reaction to finding the body and his sudden convenient headaches. She also remembered the missing signet ring. If the Colonel was dead earlier than reported, Hawes was the only one with unsupervised access to the room during that critical window. But why would a curate take a ring? Unless, of course, the ring contained something other than a crest, perhaps a secret compartment or a key that the Colonel had used to keep the curate in subjection. The revelation of Mrs. Lestrange's illness and her true identity as the woman from the Colonel's past acted as a smokescreen, reinforcing the killer's deception. While the police were distracted by the drama of a dying woman's regret, the real killer was likely preparing to dispose of the last piece of incriminating evidence. Miss Marple realized that the bang heard by the village was not a gun at all, but perhaps a common firemaster's toy or a bursting paper bag, a simple, childish sound used to anchor a lie in the minds of honest people. She watched as Inspector Slack's car raced toward the station, his mind undoubtedly occupied with the legalities of Mrs. Lestrange's statement. He was still chasing the noise, while Miss Marple was listening to the silence. She knew that the truth didn't scream, it whispered from the dust on a windowsill and the snag of a silk thread. The secret at the vicarage was nearing its end, but the most dangerous moment was yet to come. The killer, sensing the net was twitching, would be at their most desperate. Miss Marple adjusted her spectacles, her eyes fixed on the distant spire of the church. It was time to stop watching and start playing her own game. The afternoon sun was beginning to cast long, skeletal shadows across the vicarage lawn as Miss Marple made her way toward the church. She did not seek out the inspector, nor did she join the cluster of gossip still lingering near the post office. Instead, she found herself in the cool, dimly lit interior of the vestry, where Mr. Hawes was purportedly busy with the parish accounts. The air in the small stone room was thick with the scent of old paper and damp stone, a stark contrast to the vibrant summer heat outside. Mr. Hawes sat at a small oak table, his posture so rigid it seemed as though his very bones were made of iron. "Good afternoon, Mr. Hawes," Miss Marple said, her voice dropping into that tone of gentle, fluttery concern she used so effectively. "I do hope your headache has improved. It is such a trial, the constant pressure of these past few days. I was just saying to the vicar that we must all look after one another when the shadows of the past come to light." The curate looked up, his eyes bloodshot and restless. "It is the weight of the sin, Miss Marple. The colonel was a man of judgment, and his end was a judgment in itself. But the police, they keep asking questions as if the truth could be found in a notebook." Miss Marple sat opposite him, her knitting bag resting in her lap. She did not begin to knit. Instead, she folded her hands over the clasp of her bag and looked at him with an expression of profound maternal pity. Judgment is a very heavy thing for any man to carry alone. It reminds me so much of a young man in St. Mary Mead, the son of our local chemist actually. He was a very devout boy, much like yourself, but he found himself in a position where he had to choose between his reputation and his conscience. He had taken something, you see, not out of greed, but out of a desperate need to hide a mistake he had made in his youth. She watched the curate's throat move as he swallowed hard. The psychological pressure in the room was almost tangible, like the gathering of a summer storm. "The colonel was a very thorough man," she continued softly. "He told me once that he kept his most important documents not in a safe, but on his person. He had a signet ring, did he not? A very distinctive piece. I noticed it was missing when poor Mrs. Price Ridley was describing the scene. It is a curious thing for a murderer to take, unless that ring held a key to something, perhaps a small locker at the railway station or a private drawer in this very vestry." Mr. Hawes's hands began to tremble, the paper he was holding fluttering like a wounded bird. "I don't know anything about a ring. Why are you telling me this?" "Because," Miss Marple said, her voice becoming suddenly sharply focused, "I believe you were in that study much earlier than you told the inspector. I believe you went there to plead for mercy, to ask him not to go through with the audit that would reveal the clerical error you were so worried about. And while you were there, something happened. You didn't pull the trigger, Mr. Hawes, but you saw who did, didn't you? And instead of speaking, you reached down and took that ring, believing it would give you the power to protect yourself. But the person you saw, they aren't afraid of you. They are only waiting for you to become a liability." The curate's face became a sickly shade of grey. He opened his mouth to protest, but no sound came out. He looked at Miss Marple not as a frail old lady, but as a mirror reflecting his own deepest fears. He was caught in a trap of his own making, squeezed between the memory of a killer and the weight of a stolen secret. Miss Marple didn't move. She simply waited in the silence, her eyes never leaving him. She was watching for the breaking point, the moment where the fear of the law would finally be eclipsed by the fear of the person who had actually held the gun. "The bang we all heard," she whispered, leaning in closer, "was quite a clever distraction, wasn't it? It gave everyone a time and a place. But you know that the room was silent when the clock was smashed. You were there, in silence, Mr. Hawes, and the person who stood behind that desk, they are still in this village watching you. They know you have the ring, and they know you are the only one who can truly hang them. She saw it then, the sudden, sharp flicker of absolute terror in his pupils. It wasn't the reaction of a guilty killer, but the reaction of a witness who had been threatened into a soul-crushing silence. He stood up abruptly, knocking his chair over with a clatter that echoed through the empty church. Without a word, he turned and fled toward the side door, his footsteps echoing like a heartbeat. Miss Marple remained in the vestry, her expression one of quiet, determined sadness. The game was in its final stages. She had pushed the witness out into the open, and she knew the killer would have no choice now but to follow. The following morning, the atmosphere in the vicarage was one of sombre, final reckoning. Miss Marple had requested the presence of the vicar, his wife Griselda, and a visibly impatient Inspector Slack in the very study where Colonel Prothero had met his end. The room felt smaller now, the heavy mahogany desk standing as a silent monument to a life characterized by unyielding judgment. Miss Marple sat in a straight-backed chair, her knitting needles dormant in her lap, her blue eyes bright with a sharp clinical clarity that made the inspector shift uncomfortably. He had come under protest, still clinging to the fragments of Lawrence Redding's crumbling confession, but something in Miss Marple's composure commanded a silence that even his brusque nature could not bridge. "It is a fascinating thing about the human mind," Miss Marple began, her voice soft but perfectly clear. "We are so easily led by what we expect to hear. We heard a loud bang at 6:20, and because it sounded like a shot, we assumed it was a shot. We saw a note timed at 6:20, and we assumed the Colonel was alive to write it. But in St. Mary Mead, as in life, the most obvious answer is often the one most carefully prepared for our benefit. The Colonel did not write that note at 6:20. He was already dead. The note was a forgery, and the bang was nothing more than a toy, a common firecracker designed to give a killer a perfect, unshakable alibi." Inspector Slack leaned forward, his face reddening, but Redding confessed. "Miss Marple, and the Mauser," Mr. Redding confessed because he is a foolish, romantic young man who believed he was protecting the woman he loved, Miss Marple interrupted gently. "But a man in a state of murderous rage does not stop to adjust a clock or set up a mechanical distraction. No, this was a crime of cold, calculated precision. It was a crime committed by someone who knew the vicar's schedule, someone who knew exactly where the Mauser was kept, and someone who had the most to lose if the Colonel's audit of the parish funds went forward. The Colonel was a difficult man, but he was honest. He had discovered that the church accounts were not just messy, but systematically drained." She turned her gaze slowly toward the door, where the curate, Mr. Hawes, stood supported by a constable, his face a mask of sweating agony. Mr. Hawes was the one being threatened with exposure, yes, but he was not the one with the steady hand or the theatrical mind. He was merely a witness, a terrified man who entered this room to find the Colonel already dead and, in a moment of panicked opportunism, took the signet ring to hold as leverage. The real killer was someone who could move through the vicarage with total freedom, someone who knew that a loud noise at 6:20 would draw every eye to the garden and away from the house. Miss Marple's voice took on a firmer edge as she looked at the person standing near the window. "It was you, Mr. Sanford, the schoolmaster whom everyone ignored. You weren't just a teacher, you were a man with a hidden history of debt and a deep, abiding hatred for the man who had discovered your secret past in the West Indies. You knew that Mrs. Lestrange had arrived in the village, and you knew she provided the perfect scapegoat. You stole the Mauser from Lawrence's studio, entered the study through the open window while the vicar was at the church, and shot the Colonel in cold blood. You then set the firecracker, adjusted the clock, and walked back to the fete, appearing as nothing more than a harmless, worried young man." Sanford's face went white, his eyes darting toward the exit, but the inspector's men were already moving. The iridescent blue silk I found, Miss Marple continued, was a fragment from the king's costume you were meant to repair for the school play. It snagged on the table as you reached for the colonel's desk. And the gold-tipped cigarette. You took it from Mrs. Lestrange's case earlier that day, intending to leave it as a false trail. It was a very clever performance, Mr. Sanford, but you forgot that a village like this is full of people who notice when a thread is out of place. The silence that followed was broken only by the sharp, metallic click of handcuffs. Sanford did not scream or deny it, he simply sagged, the weight of his calculated deception finally collapsing under the scrutiny of an old lady who understood the darkness of the human heart. Inspector Slack looked at Miss Marple with a newfound, if grudging, respect. The secret at the vicarage was no longer a mystery. It was merely a sad account of greed and fear, untangled by the one person who knew that even in the most peaceful garden, a weed could grow into a poison. The following week in St. Mary Mead arrived with a peculiar hushed quality, as if the village were collectively recovering from a fever. The police cars had departed, leaving only the usual ruts in the gravel paths of the vicarage, and the black-bordered notices of Colonel Prothero's funeral had been posted on the lich gate of the church. The scandal that had threatened to consume the parish was now being dismantled and filed away into the local memory, destined to be discussed in hushed tones over tea for the next 50 years. Life, with its relentless and often indifferent momentum, began to resume its outward appearance of order. The baker made his rounds, the bells rang for Sunday service, and the flowers in the vicarage garden continued to bloom with a vibrant, unbothered persistence that seemed almost a rebuke to the violence that had occurred within the study walls. Miss Marple sat in her small garden, her knitting needles clicking with a steady, restorative rhythm. The sun was warm on her shoulders, and the scent of lavender and stocks filled the air, creating an atmosphere of such profound peace that the events of the previous days felt almost like a fragment of a half-remembered dream. Across the hedge she could see the vicar, Mr. Clement, standing by his sundial. He looked older, his shoulders slightly more stooped, but there was a newfound clarity in his gaze. The cloud of suspicion that had hung over his household had evaporated, though it had left behind a residue of sadness for the waste of human potential. The curate, Mr. Hawes, had been sent away for a long period of rest and spiritual retreat, his nerves shattered but his soul perhaps more honest for having been purged of its secrets. Price Ridley arrived at the gate, her footsteps crunching with an air of renewed importance. She did not enter, but leaned over the wood, her eyes wide with the latest tidbit of information. "They say Mr. Sanford had been planning it for months, Jane," she whispered, her voice a mix of horror and gratified curiosity. "To think he was teaching our children. It makes one shudder to realize how little we know of those we see every day. And that poor Mrs. Lestrange, she died last night in the cottage. Dr. Haydock says it was very peaceful, a sad, tangled business, wasn't it?" Miss Marple nodded gently, her needles never pausing. "It is a very sad business indeed, dear, but then the human heart is a very tangled place. We like to think of people as being either entirely good or entirely bad, like the characters in a simple play. In reality, we are all made of such complicated threads. Mr. Sanford was a man who allowed his fear of the past to become a monster that eventually devoured his future. It is a tragedy that is repeated more often than we care to admit, even in a quiet place like St. Mary Mead. Once Mrs. Price Ridley had moved on to spread her news further down the lane, Miss Marple let her knitting rest in her lap. She looked toward the church spire, thinking of the iridescent blue silk and the gold-tipped cigarette. They were such small things, so easily overlooked by the heavy-handed efficiency of the police, yet they had been the keys to a house of lies. It reminded her of the time the old draper's wife had tried to hide a scorched tablecloth by turning it over. only to forget that the pattern on the other side didn't quite line up. People always leave a mark, she mused. The difficulty lies in having the patience to see it for what it truly is. She thought of Anne Prothero and Lawrence Redding, who had both left the village to seek a fresh start elsewhere. Their romance, once a source of such high drama, had been cooled by the harsh reality of a murder investigation. It was a sobering thought that even the most passionate feelings could be stained by the proximity of a crime. The secret at the vicarage was solved. The murderer was behind bars, and the village had been vindicated, but Miss Marple knew that things would never be quite the same. The innocence of the parish had been lost, replaced by a wary understanding of the darkness that can lurk behind a polite smile or a well-tended garden. As the afternoon shadows began to lengthen, casting long purple fingers across the grass, Miss Marple picked up her basket and prepared to go inside. She was an old woman who had seen much of the world's folly, yet she still found a strange, quiet comfort in the predictability of human nature. It was the knowledge that even in the midst of chaos there was a pattern to be found, a logic that governed even the most irrational acts. She went into her house and closed the door, a small solitary figure who remained the most formidable guardian of the truth in all of St. Mary Mead. The curtain had finally fallen on the tragedy, and Miss Marple was content to let the silence return,